So let's open up. This is fun. This is fun. Let's open up today's show by talking about a Mr. Samuel Harris. You may notice I have a one of Sam's most famous misquotes. Of course, I took this quote out of context here.
All of a sudden, we can't talk about Neanderthal DNA anymore.
Obviously, I took that out of context. I'm so sorry, Mr. Sam Harris. But again, Sam Harris is a guy that I really should pay attention to more personally just because I read all of his books when I was a teenager. Sam Harris, right? For those of you that don't know, Sam Harris was kind of like this weird kind of like grifter from the new atheist kind of thing that was happening in the early 2000s, right? You've got, you know, people like Richard Dawkins, right? You got people like Christopher Hitchens, these like, brilliant scientific philosophical minds. And then you got Sam Harris, who's like just some goofball that kind of just like hitched his wagon to that. And then like Chris Hitchens died and like Richard Dawkins, like no one cares about him anymore. I don't know what's going on with Daniel Dennett either. But Sam Harris kind of rebranded himself a couple years ago into this whole thing, the intellectual dark web, which was a project of like people that like claimed to be counterculture, except they were famous, they had books, they were on TV every day, but they kept claiming that they were censored, right? And every time they claimed that they were censored, Jordan Peterson, Ben Shapiro, Dave Rubin, Sam Harris, every time that they claimed that they were censored, they would get more and more followers. So it was kind of like one of those weird, like their grift was everyone hates me and no one talks to me, yet they are getting millions of dollars on Patreon and their podcasts get millions of listens. So it was like a really bizarre grift. And then when Donald Trump was elected, that was kind of like, it was like, Trump is there, he won, and Sam Harris kind of positioned himself as like the left voice of the intellectual dark web. So whenever they do these like group podcasts, he would say like, "Oh, Trump is bad," right? And then you'd have Dave Rubin that would be like, "Well, Trump's not that bad," and then Ben Shapiro would be like, "I love Donald Trump. He's great. It's kind of dumb, but he's awesome." And so now that Joe Biden has won, you see the likes of Ben Shapiro who like, are just, they're very upset. They hate Biden. They think Biden's a rabid communist. You see Dave Rubin who, even though he's gay, is like buckling on the issues of, oh, should gay marriage be legal? Well, it should be up to the states, Dave Rubin says, right? Even though he is in fact gay himself. But you see all these people that Sam Harris hitched his wagon to just acting like total goofballs. And so with that introduction, here's Sam Harris officially resigning. He is reading his open letter of resignation from the intellectual dark web. Let's listen.
Insofar as I've noticed what others in the so-called intellectual dark web have been saying, it's generally not something I want to be associated with. I don't want to single anyone out in particular.
I might, that's like really, I'm just going to listen to that again. That's a really good like sound drop potential. Is generally something I don't want to be associated with. That is so good. It's so good.
Insofar as I've noticed,
but it gets better.
What others in the so-called intellectual dark web have been saying, it's generally not something I want to be associated with. I don't want to single anyone out in particular, but allow me to take this moment to turn in my imaginary membership card to this imaginary organization.
So again, what he's doing right here is he's trying to distance himself. I get it, right? When you have Dave Rubin, an openly married gay person, going out there and saying that gay marriage should be left up to the states and that Trump is the real winner and that Joe Biden is going to try to eat your babies, right? You don't want to be a part of that. Like when you have Ben Shapiro going up there like saying that like there's no such thing as a wet ass pussy and that if someone has a wet ass pussy that it must be a medical condition, right, publicly humiliating himself on a daily basis, you don't want to be a part of that. When you see the Weinsteins, all right, doing this like unity thing where like, oh yeah, we're going to draft Tulsi Gabbard for president, right? You don't want to be associated with that. Why? Because it's cringe. It's cringe. So this is the thing, is there's a balancing act here, and I'm going to play the rest of this in a second, but there's a balancing act here, right? Yes, it's good when people realize the mistakes that they've made and try to move on from those mistakes. That is good, and that should be encouraged. Is Sam Harris going to be like a communist on Twitter all of a sudden? I don't think so, but it's a good idea for him to distance himself. That is a net positive. And And the reasons that he has, and he's about to go into, are pretty funny. But the thing is, you have to understand, this guy was one of the sole reasons, like, in the same instances of, like, the new atheist, like, Four Horsemen cringe from the early 2000s, right? Sam Harris kind of hitched his wagon to more qualified people. And this is one of those situations where he gained those qualifications, and then you have the likes of Dave Rubin try to hitch his wagon to Sam Harris in a way that it's like, oh, now people are trying to ride on my coattails. And that's the thing you need to realize here, is that this is all self-preservation. He wants to retain his own, like, credibility. Now that Joe Biden's going to be president, he doesn't want anything to do with this cringe project that has given him Patreon dollars over the last couple years.
I mean, the IDW was always tongue-in-cheek, from my point of view. It was a funny name for a group of people who were willing to discuss difficult topics in public. Mostly
A bunch of, like, white men that are willing to discuss difficult topics, such as transgender rights. Yeah. That's, I mean, again, counterculture stuff.
public, mostly on podcasts. But it never made sense for us to be grouped together as though we shared a common worldview. I never saw much downside to it, and I didn't much think about it. But in the aftermath of this election, with some members of this fictional group sounding fairly bonkers, I just want to make it clear that I'm not part of...
And of course, what he's talking about is Dave Rubin.
And by the way, I don't think that's some grand conspiracy. I think this is sort of what power is. I mean this at a sort of high level.
Right, he's talking about Dave Rubin, who is, in fact, bonkers, and that's correct. But again, one of the things here that Sam Harris is doing is he's trying to downplay, his involvement. Oh, it's imaginary, it's fictitious. You know, it's not like we did thousands of podcasts together. No. It's not like we had New York Times profiles about us. No, by the way, we have the New York Times giving us profiles, yet we're censored and no one will talk to us. It's weird, right? Why doesn't the New York Times give me a profile? That's a free speech issue. Anytime a mainstream outlet doesn't run a story about me, I'm being censored. It's a free speech issue. I just want to note that I used to listen to Sam Harris's podcast like 5 years ago, back when it was called Waking Up. You know, like, his podcast started as, like, some weird, like, meditation-focused, like, kind of self-help thing. And, 5 years ago, I was into that shit. And then, like, a couple years ago, he changed the title from Waking Up to Making Sense. And that was, like, the IDW grift. So I just want to throw that out there. It's really funny. But again, it is good that Sam Harris is trying to distance himself from these people, because they are bonkers, as he says. But you have to understand, it doesn't mean all of a sudden that you can absolve him of all the trafficking of cringe that he's done. Sam Harris going on Dave Rubin's show 3 years ago, is one of the main reasons why Dave Rubin is in the place that he is. Dave Rubin hitched himself to Sam Harris's wagon, and at this point, Sam Harris feels like a Dr. Frankenstein kind of responsibility here.
Sounding fairly bonkers. I just want to make it clear that I'm not part of any group, right? So if you want to criticize my ideas, that's great. But I only represent myself here, and no one else speaks for me.
So again, there is Sam Harris officially exiting the intellectual expedition known as the intellectual dark web, which again, it's fictitious. The IDW is nothing more than a thought experiment, and and it is no longer a thought experiment because it's over apparently. So I thought that was really, really funny. I thought, like, again, really funny stuff. And as someone who actually fell for the Sam Harris thing when I was a teenager, I feel like I have a responsibility to explain to my audience that this guy is no good. He's no good. So there you go. Sam Harris officially exiting from the fictitious group that does not exist, but he's exiting it nonetheless.